Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It begins with the smallest things, a finger bone resting just above the soil line, a tooth tucked into an ancient drainage trench, a femur lodged sideways inside a tomb meant to hold only ashes. These fragments, dug out of Ireland's ancient ground, tell a story that doesn't sit still. They belong to the dead. But the dead, it seems, didn't always stay where they were put. Across Ireland's earliest burial sites, from the Neolithic passage tombs of Newgrange and Carrickeel to the Bronze Age cemeteries in the Midlands, archaeologists have uncovered a strange, persistent pattern. Graves that were opened not once, but many times. Bones that were removed, rearranged, broken, burned, returned. Skulls placed delicately in niches. Leg bones missing entirely. Rib cages disturbed, not by animals, not by accident, but by human hands. Deliberate, repeated, quiet. At first, these details were dismissed as ancient tomb robbing. An understandable assumption. Many later sites were looted, long after their builders had faded. But these burials were different. They weren't ransacked. They weren't stripped. The goods were often untouched. Only the bones had been moved, and not taken far, sometimes just an inch. Sometimes swapped with another. Sometimes repositioned so a face now looked the other way, toward the chamber's narrow slit of light. Why? Why open a tomb only to move the dead? To answer that, we must walk slowly, carefully, like one of the living, stepping into the darkness of a stone-lined passage with a torch in hand, in the air thick with centuries of silence. Welcome to Carrickeel. Hi. In the hills of County Sligo lies a cluster of passage tombs dating back more than 5,000 years. From a distance, they resemble nothing more than stone heaps, lumps in the grass, shaped like sleeping animals. But inside, the mystery deepens. Many of the tombs were found partially open, not collapsed, not looted, just unsealed, and inside, the remains told a story of strange interruptions. One chamber revealed a mixture of burned and unburned bones. Long bones broken deliberately, likely while still fresh. Skulls placed upside down. A pelvis that had been turned and wedged beneath a flat stone. But the bodies weren't dumped. They were placed, which meant someone came back after death, after burial. After enough time had passed for the flesh to fall away, someone returned and changed the dead. In Irish folklore, there is a deep, ancient discomfort with the idea of the restless dead. Not just ghosts, but physical return, corporeal, uneasy. The fear was not only that a spirit might linger, but that the body itself might walk again. The word revenant doesn't appear in Irish medieval literature the way it does in continental European texts, but the idea is there, always under the surface. In stories of corpses that moan, that rise, that must be pinned down, in whispers of burial mounds that open at night, and long before those stories were written down, the bones were telling us the same thing. Because here's what's most unsettling. The bones weren't just moved. They were interacted with in several sites. Archaeologists found small grooves along the edges of human bones, subtle, patterned cuts. These weren't caused by animals or burial damage. They were incisions, thin slices made with flint tools, not deep enough to shape or sever, just enough to mark. One explanation is the fleshing kind of ritual cleaning. It's practiced in many cultures, but the timing is strange. It appears to have occurred after the body had partially decomposed, when flesh still clung to sinew, when marrow still softened the core of bone. Not an easy time to work with a corpse, not a clean time. Whoever made those marks was intimate with decay, and in several cases, the bones would then return to the same tomb, like someone had borrowed them, done something, and brought them back. There are sites in Connaught where certain bones appear to have been selected again and again, skulls especially. One chamber showed evidence that a single cranium had been lifted and moved at least 5 times over a 300-year period. Each time returned to a slightly different position, like a performance or conversation. But what kind of conversation lasts centuries? One possibility is ancestor veneration, that these tombs were not final resting places, but storehouses of presence. The dead were not gone. They were close, reachable, and sometimes, perhaps, necessary. But there's another possibility. Not reverence, but fear, because some tombs go beyond rearrangement. They show signs of containment. At a site near Loucrew, a burial chamber was found with its interior passage deliberately collapsed, not from age, but from effort. Heavy stones rolled inward, trapping the space, sealing the bones, and in the center, a single adult skull, fractured and buried face down. Face-down burial in ancient Ireland was rare, and when it occurs, it's often linked with people believed to be dangerous even in death. This idea persists even into the early medieval period. Burying the dead face down or binding their limbs was a way to prevent return. So did this belief stretch all the way back to the Neolithic, where the builders of the first Irish tombs not just laying there dead to rest, but watching them. The architecture supports the theory. Passage tombs like those at Knowth and Newgrange were designed with extremely narrow entranceways, corridors, just wide enough for one adult to pass through at a time, and always with a sharp turn or a light trap, so that the chamber itself stayed dark, controlled, and yet every solstice of light would return. A single beam at sunrise would creep down the long corridor, touch the inner chamber, and illuminate the bones every year, as if waking them. And perhaps that's exactly what people feared. That light would bring life, that bones would rise, that silence would end. So they opened the tombs, rearranged the bones, turned the skulls, removed the legs, not to honor, but to keep the dead in, still, bound, watchful. This may sound dramatic, but across early Irish burial culture, the fear of return is written in quiet choices. Heavy stones placed on chests, limbs missing, faces turned toward walls. It's subtle, it's gentle, but it's consistent. A culture doesn't need to scream to express anxiety. Sometimes it just rearranges what it loves and what it fears. And so we return to the question, why did the dead keep returning in ancient Ireland? Maybe they didn't. Maybe it was only the living, haunted by memory, by dreams, by silence, too heavy to carry alone, who went back again and again. And in those tombs of darkness and earth, they found only bones, but something deeper lingered. Not ghosts, not spirits, but responsibility. A sense that death was not done, that rest was not permanent, that the line between body and world could be crossed, which leaves us standing now in the entrance of a narrow passage tomb. The air cold, the ground uneven, the stone walls older than empire, and we wonder were the dead disturbed because they might return, or because they never truly left. The dead were not expected to rest forever. In modern cemeteries, burial is final. The earth closes and we do not return. We mark the spot with names, dates, inscriptions to keep the past sealed in text and marble. But for ancient Ireland's earliest people, the grave was a doorknot, a vault, and some doors were made to open again. They built tombs with corridors, not pits, with chambers, not graves. And those chambers were not hidden. They were made of stone, layered with effort, ringed with curved stones, covered in grass and reopened again and again. It's the reopening that reveals the truth. Across dozens of Neolithic passage tombs, especially in the Boyne Valley, at sites like Noth and Doubt, archaeologists have documented patterns that can only be explained by repeated visits, not casual ones, not burials forgotten and disturbed. No, these were acts of memory. These tombs were entered multiple times over centuries, sometimes for new burials, sometimes for rearrangement, sometimes for reasons we still don't understand. At Noth, the largest of all, there are over 17 satellite tombs clustered around the Great Mound. Some chambers contain skeletal fragments arranged in pattern schools, grouped together, long bones set side by side, small bones piled like offerings. In other tombs, body parts were clearly moved after decomposition, not as a group, as individuals. A skull removed, returned, a pelvis lifted, placed. Archaeologist George Eogan, who excavated Noth across decades, Kata, that the tomb was more like a living archive than a cemetery. Kata, people came and went not daily, but ritually, predictably. They re-engaged with the dead as part of the annual calendar, and the calendar always circled around the sun. You must understand, these tombs were not just dark holes. They were instruments, timekeepers. They were aligned with astronomical events, solstices, equinoxes, lunar cycles. The entrance to Newgrange, for example, is so precisely cut that for only a few minutes each year on the winter solstice, sunlight pierces the narrow passage and strikes the back wall of the inner chamber. The beam climbs slowly, as if waking the stones. It lights the place where bones once lay. Not metaphor, fact. The first archaeologists assumed this light was symbolic, a metaphor for rebirth, for the soul's journey, for the promise of spring, and it may have been. But now we ask, what if it was more? What if the light was part of a ritual that required presence? What if people entered the tomb that morning, lit by that narrow sunbeam, and interacted with the remains? Perhaps they touched the skulls, repositioned them, whispered, cleaned, left food or drink, or simply sat in the cold, watching as the light fell and faded. Not a celebration, a reckoning, because in ancient Ireland, memory didn't belong to the mind. It lived in places, in bones, in stone, and when a person died, they didn't leave the world. They changed their location within it, from breath to shadow, from field to chamber, and once placed there, they might still need tending. This is difficult for modern minds. We live in a world where the dead are final. Cultures saw the dead differently, not absent, not gone, but latent, waiting, occasionally awake. There is evidence, even, of burials with deliberate pause. At La Crue, archaeologists uncovered a series of bones arranged carefully with stones placed between them, limiting contact between body parts, not disorder. Control. This arrangement suggests a process, a waiting period. The body left to decompose naturally, with separation built into the ritual, and then, after time, the parts rearranged, perhaps stored, perhaps distributed. Some tombs show signs that certain bones, especially skulls, were removed, curated, and later returned. We don't know where they went, but they came back, and that changes everything, because it means the tomb was not just a resting place, it was a kind of library, a place where the essence of people was kept, retrieved, consulted, and maybe feared, because in this period, Island's people began to adopt certain precautions. Large stones were found placed across the entrances of some tombs, not rolled into place, but hoisted with intent, too heavy for casual use, meant not to mark, but to close, to seal. And in one particularly strange case, Passage tomb in the west of Ireland revealed scorch marks around its entryway. Not inside, outside, as if fire had been used not to warm, not to ward, to warn. It's subtle, but the implication runs deep. The tomb was not just sacred, it was dangerous. It held something that needed containment. Was it the soul? A memory? A power? Or was it simply the fear that the body inside might somehow return? It's not hard to imagine. In the darkness of winter, when light fades early and cold creeps under every stone, the mind drifts. You will remember the dead. You hear sounds at night, and you wonder if the seal on the tomb still holds. Even millennia later, we feel it. There are farmers in rural Ireland who, to this day, will not disturb certain mounds. They call them fairy hills, and they leave them untouched, not because of beauty, but because of fear. Not fear of ghosts, but of return. Ancestral memory runs long, and in the soil, it clings. But the returning dead of ancient Ireland weren't always hostile. Sometimes they were needed, called upon, consulted. Some tombs bear marks of prolonged use residue from food. Traces of milk, crushed berries, ash from repeated fires. It's as if people came there not just to bury, but to commune. The line between the ancestor and deity is thin. A grandmother who once nursed children may now nurse the soil. A father who once hunted may now guide the deer's path. A child who died young may now speak through wind, but only if remembered, only if returned to. And so they kept returning to the tombs. A key, not just to see the dead, but to keep them present, still, familiar, and sometimes to put them back where they belonged, because the earth doesn't always hold. Sometimes the bones shift, sometimes the ground opens, sometimes especially in the cold months, something rises, and that's when people acted. They resealed, reburied, rearranged, they reasserted control, not because they didn't love the dead, but because they respected what they had become, and what they might still do. The Irish Neolithic people lived in a world where time wasn't linear. It moved in cycles, spirals, rings, like the carvings on the tombs at Newgrange, and note those swirling, interlocking circles whose meanings still can't decode, but we understand enough. The dead were part of that spiral. They didn't stay in one place. They turned, they moved, and the living turned with them. So when we ask why the dead wouldn't stay buried, perhaps we should ask something else. Were they ever meant to? You have to understand, they didn't believe in stillness, not the way we do. Not the way cemeteries today offer silence with fences, hedges, engraved granite stones. To ancient Ireland, death wasn't the end of movement. It was its continuation through a slower rhythm, through bone, soil. It's time that in the Neolithic and Bronze Ages, long before parchment or kings, the Irish landscape was dotted with sacred spaces for the dead. But these weren't final destinations. They were parts of a much larger system, a landscape-wide ritual calendar, built on seasonal return, and the dead returned, to dot sometimes as memory, sometimes as bone, sometimes in ways no archaeologist can fully name. Let's return for a moment to one of the most studied sites, Newgrange. Its inner chamber, built 5,000 years ago, remains a marvel. When the winter solstice sun breaks the horizon, a single shaft of light pierces a small opening above the door. The roof boxing slides down a narrow passageway, illuminating the chamber floor. It lasts only a few minutes. It is gone. Another year must pass before it returns. This precise phenomenon was not discovered in the modern era by accident. Locals had long believed the mound was special, fairy haunted, they said, or lit from within. They didn't know that deep inside it, someone had designed the structure so the sun would kiss the dead only once a year. It's a tomb, yes, but it's also a ritual instrument, a calendar, a portal. Inside, when first excavated, archaeologists found the remains of at least 5 individuals. just fragments, burned, disarticulated, mixed, but not jumbled. They were laid in shallow stone basins, formed, boned, placed with care, broken, yes, but not discarded. And in one of the chambers, a skull fragment bore evidence of having been handled many times. The surface was polished naturally smooth, for something left untouched. It had been picked up repeatedly, perhaps passed around, perhaps kissed, perhaps simply held in silence during the long dark of midwinter. People came back, not just to bury Dot, to engage, to commune. Other tombs told similar stories. At Lau-Cru, chambers were reopened centuries after first use. The bones inside were rearranged. Some were removed. Some were returned. The reasons are not written down, but the rhythms are clear. A tomb is not a box, it's a breathing structure. It inhales the dead, exhales memory, Dot, over and over again. There are Bronze Age examples too. At Ross Island, a small burial site yielded signs of continued visitation. Hearts built outside the tomb, burnt offerings, clay cups left near the entrance long after the original burials. People came, even when the burial was already ancient. They didn't dig, they didn't enter, but they still remembered. Perhaps that's the most important thing to understand about the Irish dead. They were retained, not in names or histories, but in action, in repetition. Each visit was not a moment of grief, but an active participation in a larger, endless cycle. To bury was not to let go. It was to begin something, and when that something grew too quiet, when bones settled too deeply, or when fear crept in, people returned, reopened, rearranged, just to feel again that connection between worlds. This also explains one of the strangest patterns: selective disturbance. It didn't happen to every burial, not even most, but in certain sites, specific bones, especially skulls, were removed and later returned, and not all at once. You'll find a chamber with dozens of bones arranged in clusters, but the skulls are staggered. One appears to have been missing for a time, then placed back. Another sits outside the circle. Another is nestled upright, like it's been displayed. Why? No proof, but the hypothesis gaining quiet momentum is that these skulls were taken into use, carried during ceremonies, displayed during midwinter rites, brought to gatherings, then returned. They weren't trophies, they were kin, an Irish tradition. Even into the medieval period, the head was sacred. It was the seat of spirit. Warriors were often depicted with enemies' heads as symbols, not of victory, but of power over memory. To keep a head was to keep the soul. So what if this practice started not with enemies, but with family? What if, for generations, people carried the heads of their own dead to ask questions, to guard feasts, to ward off misfortune, and when their presence was no longer needed, to return them to the earth? Some tombs seem to expect this. The chambers at Knockrow, for instance, are shaped not like graves, but like gathering spaces. The walls are carved with spirals and lozenges, symbols of movement, of return. They aren't facing one direction. They curve, they wrap, like time, like memory, like breath. And all this bones lifted and laid, heads removed and replaced. Fire lit outside doors of stone tells us one thing. They didn't bury their dead to forget them. They buried them to keep them. So, when we find that a passage tomb has been opened 7 times in 200 years, when we see that a skull has been polished with handling, when we find a child's femur wedged under a stone in a place where it wasn't buried the first time, we are not looking at destruction. We're looking at communication. Maybe reverent, maybe fearful, but always intimate, which brings us back to the beginning. The idea that the dead wouldn't stay buried. They weren't supposed to. Not really. They belonged to the earth. Yes, but also to the air, to the stories, to the people still. kneeling at the edge of tombs, whispering through the stone, and we are left to whisper back in quiet rooms, in museum halls. In winter, because whether we remember them through study, through storytelling, or through silence, the rhythm is the same dot. Open, close, return, and somewhere, the darkness of a narrow chamber, lit only once a year, the light finds the back wall. It rests for a moment, then vanishes again. And you wondered, did they build all this just to remind us that no one is ever truly gone? The story was buried with him. A man, mid-30s, found face up in a shallow grave somewhere in the west of Ireland. The earth above him had long since settled, pressed flat by centuries of wind, rain, grass, and silence. But something was wrong. Something that made the archaeologists kneel down just a little slower, because across the man's chest lay a boulder, a wide, flat stone, too large to have fallen there by chance, too perfectly placed to be coincidence. Its weight pressed down where lungs would have once drawn breath, and there was another, smaller, but just as deliberate across his legs, one pinning the torso, one pinning the limbs. There was no clothing left, no grave goods, no tools or weapons. Just a body and stones, laid in earth, covered in time, and remembered by no one except the ground itself. The discovery wasn't entirely unique. In fact, similar burials have surfaced across the island. Corpses held in place by rock, sometimes even staked through with sharpened posts. For years, scholars debated whether it was punishment or protection. Was the man feared or sacred? But the real question was simpler. Why would anyone need to hold a body down? To understand that, you must understand the Irish relationship with the dead, not just the spirits, but the physical corpse itself. It was not a passive thing. It held power. Even as it rotted, it was watched. Even as it was buried, it was still a presence. In many rural traditions of much older beliefs, corpse could still feel, still hear, still respond, and, if left untended, still rise. This idea was not unique to Ireland. We see it in the European folklore of revenants, the walking dead, rising from the grave to bring illness, misfortune, or simple terror. In Eastern Europe, stakes were driven through the chest. In Germany, the dead were buried with their mouths full of stones to stop them from speaking. In Ireland, they were pinned, not by wood, not by metal, but by Earth's oldest weapon stone. The pinned burials began appearing most commonly in the early medieval period, around the 7th to 12th centuries, but their roots likely go deeper. We find stone weights on burials as far back as the late Bronze Age, always placed with care, always deliberate, at Kiltasheen in County Roscommon. Archaeologists uncovered a cemetery of nearly 130 individuals buried beside the ruins of a medieval church. But two graves were different. Both were male. Both buried without honor, no shrouds, no markers, and both pinned with large stones. One had a heavy slab across the chest. The other had stones driven through his limbs and mouth. They weren't criminals. No trauma, no wounds, just fear. Someone feared they might come back. There's no mention of these practices in written Irish law codes. No clerical rulebooks saying, if a man returns from the grave, pin him down. These weren't legal actions. They were emotional ones. Community responses to unease, to unexplained deaths, to lingering illness, to dreams too vivid, to footsteps heard after burial. Some say these were bad deaths. People who died improperly, without the last rites, without family, without peace. Others say they were witches, or cursed, or simply strange. The kind of people no one really knew in life, and didn't trust in death. But some of the pinned were children. Some were old women. Some, like the man in the West, bore no obvious mark of wrongdoing. So perhaps it wasn't who they were, but what the community believed about them. We are shaped by our stories. In Ireland's stories older than written history tell again and again of the dead who rise. In the Tain Buck-Kellynch, the Irish epic of heroes in war, there are moments when ghosts speak from the ground, when the dead rise not as spirits, but in form, to warn, to fight, to curse. Later, in Christian legends, the dead are sealed in earth with blessings and symbols. But when the blessing was not enough, stone remained at a site in Meath. A skeleton was found with small stones tucked into the mouth, hands, and eye sockets. They weren't tools. They weren't offerings. They were plugs to block the ways a soul might escape. The eyes to stop seeing. The hands to stop grasping. The mouth to stop calling out. The stones were not violent. Were preventative. And that's what makes these burials so difficult to categorize. They weren't acts of hate. They were acts of fear and of care, twisted by fear. Because what happens when the boundary between life and death becomes too thin? When someone dies, but doesn't stay gone. There are accounts, medieval ones, the Marbio, literally the living dead. Corpses that seem to stir after burial. Dreams that feel too real. Illnesses that spread from a freshly dug grave. The solution: weigh the body down, drive in stakes, place thorns across the heart, or, most simply, lay a stone across the chest. It didn't need to be a commandment. It only needed to be a memory. Passed from hand to hand, stone to stone, and in the ground. It stayed. Returning to our man, he was buried in isolation, not far from a stone ring fort. No other bodies nearby. No sign of ritual. Just 2 stones. One across his chest. One across his legs. He wasn't bound. He wasn't mutilated. He was simply held. Some scholars have pointed out that such burials may also represent a kind of inverted honor. Dapped a stone, rather than punishment, was recognition, a sign of someone spiritually active. A person who walked the boundaries between seen and unseen. A seer, a healer, a curse-bearer, or maybe just someone who made others comfortable. We cannot know. But the repetition tells us this: whatever they feared, it happened more than once. Enough for the community to have a response. Enough for that response to be remembered, and repeated. And now, hundreds of years later, the earth lifts its veil. The bones lie still. The stones remain. But the question lingers: did they pin the dead to protect the living? Or to protect the dead from returning to a world that had already forgotten them? We think of graves as private, final, sealed, but in early medieval Ireland, the grave was not always a secure resting place. Sometimes it had to be remade, reopened, corrected, and sometimes had to be restrained, because the fear wasn't that the dead had left too soon, it was that they might come back. Let's go deeper into the burial at Kiltasheen, where 2 male skeletons were found near a medieval church. This was not a large cemetery. The site served a small rural community, and most of the graves were ordinarily laid east to west, arms crossed or by the side, with modest signs of religious burial. But these 2, their graves broke the pattern. One man was buried with 2 large slabs of stone, one over his chest, one over his feet. His body was intact, but those stones would have made it impossible for the chest to rise. The legs could not move. Not that the body would have tried, we tell ourselves, but clearly. Someone wasn't sure. The other burial was even stranger. A series of stones had been driven into the soil through his arms and legs. Not sharp like stakes, but long and narrow, enough to wedge the limbs in place, pinning, fixing. Not damage, not post-decomposition, prevention, and the key detail. These burials were placed just outside the church grounds, not far, just beyond the informal boundary marked by low banks and post holes. Not quite inside the community of the dead, not quite outside. A threshold burial. Liminal. As if even in death, these men couldn't be fully welcomed or fully cast out. They were treated cautiously, not hated, not honored, just watched, and if they stirred, the weight would hold them. Some have argued that these were simply deviant burials, people who had violated norms, who died violently or without a priest, but neither skeleton showed trauma, number, wounds, no signs of execution. They weren't punished, they were contained. And that brings us to an uncomfortable question that hangs in the air at sites like this. Did they think it would happen again? Because the folklore says yes. It's one thing to read about beliefs in the returning dead. It's another to find archaeological evidence that someone acted on it. Across Ireland, in dozens of scattered cases, stones show up in strange positions. On the dead, some are laid across the face, some in the mouth, others at the throat. Almost all of these placements correspond to vulnerable or symbolic places where the soul is thought to exit, or where breath once passed. At Ballyhana, near Donegal, a young woman was found buried with her limbs tied inwards, forced into unnatural angles and with heavy stones surrounding her feet and pelvis. The burial wasn't rushed. It was neat, but controlled, composed, and it had been done in isolation. She had no grave neighbors. Silence. The burial had no Christian markers, no east-facing position. She wasn't turned toward the rising sun. She was turned in on herself. Some researchers suggest that the stones placed around her pelvis may have been symbolic, a way of binding something internal. Shame, fertility, sign, or perhaps, again, just fear. Fear that something would move. It's here we must speak about one of Ireland's older fears, the abertac. Long before the word vampire entered common European use, the Irish had tales of the abertaca, restless dead man who rose nightly to drain the life from his neighbors. He was not spectral. He was not invisible. He had a body, and he had to be buried face down or bound with stones. Or, in some versions, killed with a sword made of yew wood. The legend is thought to come from oral traditions, centuries older than its earliest written version. Te Ivetic was not evil in a mythological sense. He had simply not accepted his death. He returned, not with rage, but with need, and that need made him dangerous. Now, imagine living in a small, scattered, rural settlement. A man dies not long after a strange illness. Days later, others fall sick. Livestock perish. Dreams turn dark. You do not write. You do not read. You remember. And so, one night, before the others see, you and two others return to the grave. You dig. You open the soil. And there he is, mouth open, limbs loose, and just in case, you take stones, one across the chest, one at the throat, one tucked behind the knees. You place them. You press the soil. You say nothing. You go home. This may not have happened, but bones suggest that something like it did, because this pattern repeats across counties, across centuries. Pinned burials, salated, cautious. In some cases, entire cemeteries develop edges of the uneasy dead burials that do not match the community norm. People remembered, but not embraced. One theory holds that these were marginal figures, strangers, travelers, the mentally ill, the sick, those who were not evil, but unpredictable. And in death, unpredictability becomes threat. So what do? You anchor them. You make the world heavy around them. You place the stone not to punish, but to reassure. And that brings us to an idea rarely spoken aloud in historical texts, but visible in bone. Protection is often a kind of love, a frightened kind, a limited kind, but love still, because these burials were not mutilations. They weren't thrown into pits. They weren't burned or scattered. They were composed. Hands were folded. Mouths were closed. They were cared for with fear. And we see this fear lingering well into later history. As late as the 17th century, records from Galway and Mayo describe villagers placing thorny branches across fresh graves, not to stop animals, but to stop movement. In some coastal areas, stones were painted with white lime and placed like eyes on top of burial mounds to see, to warn, to watch. And even today, the fear has shaped in Irish folk customs, still whispered in the West. Certain people, especially those who died during the unquiet nights around Samhain, are said to need special burials, coins on the eyes, salt at the feet, or a heavy stone at the chest, just to be sure, not out of hatred, but because the veil is thin and memory is long. So we return to the man from Kiltasheen. He lies in his grave, his arms by his sides, face to the sky. The stone presses down, not enough to crush, just enough to hold Dot and someone, perhaps alone, perhaps in the early morning after the others had left, took one final look, and then placed the stone Dot, not in judgment, but in hope that he would rest, that he would stay, that he would not return. Because not all the dead who come back bring stories. Some bring silence, some bring hunger, and some bring the kind of memory that cannot be shared, only weighted, which leaves us with the quietest question of all. Were the stones laid to keep the man from rising, or to keep the grief of his return from ever being spoken aloud? The body is buried. The earth is pressed firm. The wind moves on, but something remains unsettled, not in the bones, not in the stone, but in the space between. It's a feeling that the dead man is not truly gone, that his silence is conditional, that his stillness has been asked of him, not granted. And so the weight was placed. A stone across the chest, stone against the legs. One last message, not to the world above, but to the world below, stay. The story of the pinned corpse is not a single tale, but a pattern, a whisper through time. It does not appear in books or laws or sermons. It appears in burials, again and again, across early Christian Ireland, even as faith and ritual shifted. The stones persisted. They outlasted theology, outlasted clerics, outlasted even memory. Because something older than religion shaped the Irish fear of the unquiet dead. Something still breathing through the soil. You see it in the archaeology when you look slowly, not just at the pinned bodies but at what's missing from them. At Ballycamore, an early medieval site in County Offaly, its single grave stood out. A man laid on his side, not his back. One arm twisted beneath the spine, the other stretched away as if in refusal. A heavy river rock placed on his back. No shroud, no grave markers, no family burials nearby. He was laid in silence, but not with cruelty. His grave was aligned with the others east to west, but just slightly off, enough to feel reluctant, as if the gravedigger believed in mercy, but not trust. These misalignments matter in dozens of early medieval Irish burial sites. There's a cluster of graves just beyond the formal edges, just outside the holy circle, the margins, and within those margins, the stones lie heavier. Archaeologist Thomas Carrigain, in his studies of transitional burial practices in Ireland, speaks of a spectrum of inclusion, that the dead was sorted, not in strict categories, but in degrees. Who was safe? Who was uncertain? Who had to be watched? And the uncertain ones were often held down with care, with repetition, because the fear wasn't always what the dead might do. Sometimes it was what they carried. A person who died suddenly, alone, without witness, without sacrament. They became a question mark, a mystery, a body whose soul had no clear path. and a soul without a path might wander, or worse, return. And so the body was weighed, pinned, not with violence, but with anxiety. We find it in places where no fear should be. Children's graves, with small stones placed on the chest. Women, elderly, and without obvious cause for mistrust, buried with cobbles pressed against the legs. Monks, even one at a site in Kerry, buried alone and oddly, twisted with a stone behind the knees. None of them monsters. None of them cursed, but all questioned in an early Irish culture. Questions about death had to be answered with action, because if not, the consequences could reach the living dot. In folklore, death was not a locked door. It was a two-way path. If something was done wrongly, a burial was careless. If a name was unspoken, if a duty was left unfinished, the dead might return, not as ghosts, not as spirits, as flesh. They might knock dot, or sit silently in a chair, or appear at the edge of the firelight, staring, unblinking, and sometimes pals worse than words. In the 9th century Irish saga, Aided Derb Vergale, a woman dies horribly, and her burial is rushed. That night, her husband dreams. She rises and sits at the hearth. She does not speak. She does not weep. She only stares at him. Her presence says what words cannot. You buried me wrong. Even in legend, the living feared the silence of the wronged. Dead dot. And so, across the land, the rules formed and written, but felt. Never bury in haste. Never bury alone. And if the death was strange, weigh it down. That rule, perhaps, explains another mystery at several Irish sites, especially in Connaught. In Leinster, archaeologists found stones inside the mouths of the dead, not to prevent speech, it seems, but to anchor the breath. Breath was life, and if the last breath left without a blessing, without a witness, it might circle back. So a stone was placed, not large, just enough to press against the tongue. A physical period, a silent, full stop. The breath would go no further. You begin to feel how these small gestures, the stones, the misalignments, the separations were not random, but layered, not superstition, grief, because sometimes the living could not make sense of death. It came too fast. It left too little explanation. And so they turned to the earth, two stones, to do what their hands could not. They asked the ground to hold what they could no longer carry, and the ground listened. These practices, though fading by the high medieval period, never vanished entirely. Even in post-medieval folk tradition, echoes survive. Well into the 1800s, families in rural areas would place a resting stone on the chest of a newly dead loved one, not to hurt them, but to remind them to stay, not to leave the house, not to linger in corners, not to roam. Go peacefully, the stone said. Don't look back. Sometimes the living needed that message more than the dead, and that's what may have happened. 2. In the earliest pinned burials, the ones we now read as fear or punishment, maybe the stones were apologies. Maybe they were the only way the living knew how to say, I don't understand your death. I cannot fix it, but I can help you rest. And in that act awkward, quiet, heavy we glimpse the oldest kind of love. Not joyful, not pretty, just real. Because there is a kind of love that comes when the world no longer makes sense, when the rules don't fit, when the priest doesn't know what to say. When a body lies in the earth and silence gathers, it is a love that places a stone, not to trap, not to punish, but to say, you mattered, enough to be held, enough to be remembered, enough to be buried with the weight so you'll never be lost again. And so they left the stones, and the stones stayed, long after the names were gone, long after the fences fell, long after the hills changed shape and the sheep wandered over them, as if no one had ever lived or died there at all. But the bones remember, the stones remember, and now We remember the Dard, the man at Kiltushin, the child at Balihana, the monk in Kerry, the woman whose hands were tied not in violence, but in doubt. They were pinned, and in that pinning we hear not just fear, but the heartbeat of a people who believed the dead could rise, and maybe once or twice they did, which leaves us with only one more question. Did the weight hold them down, or hold the living together long enough to bear what could never be understood? The dig began like many others, quiet, cautious, careful not to disturb what had already rested for centuries. The ruins of a medieval church, long overgrown, nestled on a soft hill overlooking the River Shannon. Grass moved gently in the wind. Sheep bleated nearby. The stones of the church were pale and worn, their corners softened by time. They weren't looking for her. They were looking for parishioners, forgotten monks, villagers buried just beyond the church's edge. But then the trowels paused. First, they found the jawbone, disarticulated, separated from the skull, laid sideways in the soil like it had been dropped in haste. Next came the ribs, scattered, many broken, no anatomical order. Some bent at impossible angles, suggesting they'd been compressed long after death. And then the skull face dashed down a single iron spike, piercing the front of the mouth, driven through the jaw, through the tongue space, and into the earth. She had not been buried. She had been pinned. The iron bar had gone in after death, but not long after. The bones were still fresh enough to take the blow to hold the metal, and she was alone. No one had buried her in a coffin. No one had laid flowers or said prayers. No one had even kept her bones together. Her limbs had been scattered, teared, her face turned away, and her mouth had been silenced. It didn't take long for local whispers to begin. They called her the Witch of Kiltushin. But of course, that wasn't her name. No written record remains, no court documents, no accusation, trial, just a burial site, and a body that someone feared might speak again. The iron bar was not decorative. It was not jewelry. It was crude, likely a tool repurposed in a moment of panic or conviction, in the way it entered her mouth. Direct, final, deliberate. She had been made to stay quiet, and that, more than any spell, any incantation, any legend, was enough for her to become myth. But let's look carefully, because myths do not rise from nothing, and this burial was not. Random. The skeleton was dated to the 7th or 8th century era of spiritual uncertainty in Ireland. The early medieval period brought new gods, new rules, new churches, and with them, new anxieties. Pagan rites had not disappeared. They had melted into the corners, half-remembered songs, herbal charms, old women who watched the sky a little too closely, and those women, they were watched, too. We cannot say with certainty that this woman was accused of witchcraft, but the manner of her burial tells us exactly how she was remembered. Not with love, not with respect, with caution. She had no grave goods, no Christian markings, no burial alignment, just her bones and the iron that held them down. And that iron, crude as it was, spoke a language older than parchment. It said, "Don't let her speak again." This fear, the fear of a woman's voice, of her knowledge, of her persistence, is older than Christianity, older than courts. In Irish mythology, women often held power through knowledge. Think of the Cailleach, the old woman of the hills, who controls the seasons, who lives in stone and mountain and weather. Think of Bejewel, the sorceress said to have turned armies into dust. Think of the nameless being Visa, the wise women of the countryside, midwives and seers, who healed and cursed. They were respected, they were needed, but they were never safe, because when crops failed, when children died, when livestock fell ill, someone had to be blamed, and knowledge, especially female knowledge, was always dangerous. So we come back to her, the woman beneath the iron, Why was her mouth pinned? She known to speak against the church, to carry old prayers, to offer herbs instead of sacraments? Or was it something simpler? Perhaps she was strange, alone, unmarried, unrelated, unliked, and when she died, the community didn't gather. They acted, not with law, not with mercy, but with iron. The pinning of the mouth is not a common practice in Irish burial tradition. In fact, hers is the most direct and dramatic example we know of, but it echoes something older in parts of continental Europe. Similar practices existed, placing stones, iron nails, or even thorns in the mouths of those thought to be witches or vampires to prevent them from biting, paw from speaking spells, from breathing curses, and that practice may have traveled not through church doctrine, but through fear. The church at Kiltasheen, though modest, was likely a monastic settlement, a place of learning, of prayer, of conversion, and just beyond its wall lay her dot, a warning, a secret the monks never wrote down, because she had not been tried. She had been buried, unofficially, illegally, illicitly, a burial that felt more like a spell than a rite. And centuries later, we find her face turned to the earth, her mouth full of rust, her bones still resisting the narrative, because she was not erased, not fully. Her silence, imposed so long ago, could not last. Now we hear her, not in words, but in placement, in posture, in metal, and we ask, what frightened them? The iron in her mouth tells us they believed she might speak again. But what if she never had the chance to speak in the first place? What if her only crime was being seen gathering herbs at the wrong time of day, watching the stars too intently, being too old or too young or too other? What if she was buried not because of what she did, but because of who she reminded them of? The old gods, the old powers, the world they thought they had left behind. And so, in that moment, between fear and ritual, they made a decision. Pin her, not in hatred, in caution, in memory to say, she was real, and we could not understand her, so we made sure she would not return. But of course, she did, not in flesh, not in fire, but in bone, and now we know her better than anyone who buried her. We've held her teeth, measured her limbs, read her story in the rust that still clings to her jaw, and in doing so, we've broken the spell, because she speaks now not through curses, but through truth, through the silence that was never hers to keep, through the ground that could not hold her. Which leaves us with a question that should never have needed to be asked. What was the world so afraid she might say? Tech, that they sealed her mouth with iron. The silence was intentional. No record, no name, no stone, but bones. Remember what paper forgets, huh? And the woman found just outside the ancient church at Kiltasheen remembered more than most. Her jaw had been pierced through with iron, the rest of her body scattered, half reassembled by time and soil. No proper burial, no Christian rites, no sacred east-facing orientation. She had been left when no one was meant to walk, where the wind passed over without pause. But the question remains, why? Why had this woman already dead been denied the rituals that marked every Irish life from birth to grave? To answer that, we must understand what early medieval burial meant in Ireland, not in the sense of ceremony, but in the deeply social, practical role it played in rural life. In those days, burial wasn't just a religious act. It was a social contract. A promise that the dead belonged to the living, and the living had obligations to the dead. To die without burial was to die without memory, and to be buried wrong. That was a sentence worse than silence. For early Irish Christians, the ground mattered. The type of ground, it had to be blessed, consecrated, part of a growing sacred geography. The graveyard was often encircled. not just by stone walls, but by belief. It was a space where the lines between life and afterlife were maintained by careful ritual. So to be buried outside that space was not just a rejection, it was an act of fear. And the woman in Kiltashin had not just been buried beyond the sacred bounds, she had been pinned down, an iron rod driven through the mouth, the most sacred opening in Christian belief, the source of confession, of last words, of breath. It was not just punishment, it was a final sentence. You will not speak again. We don't know who drove that rod into her skull, but we know this: they were not trying to send her to hell. They were trying to keep her from coming back. This act, this physical silencing, says more about the fear of the community than it does about her. To those who buried her, the dead were never truly still. They could return not as shadows, but as presences, in dreams, in sickness, in cracked wood, in spoiled bread, in children who cried at night and would not say why, in women who died with unresolved reputations, women who were healers or midwives, or accused of things that left no proof, were the most dangerous of all, because they died with unfinished stories. It's possible the woman had lived just beyond the social threshold. Maybe she was poor, maybe she was old, maybe she had no children to defend her name. Maybe she helped too many people and made others uncomfortable with what she knew. Or maybe, like so many witches in Irish history, she was simply different. The Irish word being Feasawise woman was not always a compliment. It implied knowledge, but it also implied suspicion. A woman who knew more than she should. A woman who did not defer. A woman who used herbs instead of priests. For centuries, these women were treated with simultaneous reverence and unease. People sought them out in secret, then avoided their eyes in public. They were invited into homes when labor went wrong, and avoided when livestock sickened. They were never quite one of us until they died. And then decision had to be made. Would she be buried like the others? Or would the community take precautions? The latter choice says something that words never could. That fear outlived respect. That silence was stronger than gratitude, because if they had truly believed she was evil, she would have been burned or left to rot. But she wasn't. She was buried. Badly, yes. But buried, and iron that was rare and costly was used to keep her still. So the people who buried her didn't think she was unworthy. They thought she was unfinished, and unfinished people are dangerous. This practice piercing, weighing, silencing the dead is not unique to Kiltashin. We see traces of it across medieval Europe, especially in times of stress. During periods of plague, famine, or political unrest, burials become more careful, more symbolic, more defensive. In Poland, bodies were found with sickles laid across their throat stools, turned into barriers. In Germany, a woman was discovered with nails through her feet, her tongue removed. In England, stones in mouths appear with rising frequency during times of religious upheaval. But in Ireland, the gestures were subtler, less theatrical, more intimate. A pin through the jaw, a limb turned sideways, a single cobble tucked behind the knees. They weren't meant to horrify. They were meant to prevent. Prevent what, though? Not resurrection. That wasn't the fear. It was return. A returning presence. A returning influence. Quiet voice. Because if the woman had once cursed someone publicly or not, didn't matter whether it had been true. The curse might outlive her if she had been blamed for illness, or ruin, or crop failure. Then death didn't erase the suspicion. It made her more powerful. It gave her a story. And stories, medieval Ireland, were more dangerous than spells. Once told, they could not be untold. So they pinned her, and they waited, and nothing happened. But the fear didn't go away. It passed quietly into the next generation, into local warning tales, into the subtle ways people spoke about certain hills or avoided certain names. And centuries later, That fear finally surfaced again, not in shadow or dream, but in a dig, when archaeologists uncovered her jaw. They were the first to see her since the day she was covered, and that moment was the one her community had feared most, that she might be seen again. And she was, but instead of fear, her bones were met with study, with reverence, with questions, the very things she had once been denied. And now she rests differently, catalogued, preserved, known. She has been given something like a name, even if only a title: the Witch of Kiltasheen. A name built on fear, but also on the rediscovery of her presence. She has become a story again, but this time one she might have chosen. And in the end, it's possible that what they feared most wasn't her power, but her memory, because memory is a kind of defiance, and her bones are still defiant. Which brings us to the question left unanswered. Did they pierce her mouth to silence her, or to make sure the story stayed unfinished? And if so, are we the ones who broke the spell simply by remembering? The line between sacred and forbidden was marked by more than faith. It was drawn with stone, hedge, and shadow, quietly, persistently, without ceremony. The graveyard at Kiltasheen was no exception. It followed the old layout of early Christian Ireland: a central church, rounded boundaries, and designated burial spaces within the blessed ground. There were rules, some spoken, some merely understood. The faithful were buried near the altar, children near the elders, the recently baptized, nearest the chapel wall, and then, beyond the ring, past the boundary, where grass grew longer and stones lay askew, came the forgotten ones. They were not always criminals, They were not always sinners. They were often just inconvenient. A woman accused, but never tried. A man struck by madness. A child born under uncertain circumstances. And the woman they would later call the Witch of Kiltasheen. She lay among them. But even there, among the outsiders, she was further removed. Her body was not laid gently. Her bones were not gathered. Her mouth was not left untouched. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure her silence. The question remains, was this cruelty or caution? Because Irish folk belief, especially in rural medieval communities, often blurred the line between reverence and fear. The wise woman was revered in life and feared in death. The healer who had once saved your sister might later be blamed for your harvest failing, and the dead were never completely gone. To understand this burial, must remember what early Irish people believed about sound. Words had weight, breath had shape, a name, once spoken, echoed, a curse, once issued, traveled. The mouth was the center of that power, even long after death. The mouth was treated with respect, with suspicion. It was where final prayers were said, where confessions were whispered, where blessings and curses crossed the same threshold. To leave it unsealed was to leave a door ajar. That's why the iron rod mattered. It wasn't ornamental. It was defensive. It wasn't meant to punish the dead. It was meant to protect the living. In her community's mind, she had already said too much, or perhaps was believed to be capable of saying more, even after death. The gesture of silencing her may not have come from hate. It may have come from grief, court guilt, or fear disguised as ritual. We don't know her name, but we know this: someone was afraid she would speak again, not scream, not shout, just speak. And for some reason, that terrified them more than anything. So they buried her without blessing, without shroud, without rites. And they hammered iron through the very place where her words had once lived. Her burial site was not random. It was not in a ditch or a rubbish heap. It was near the church, but carefully placed just beyond the hallowed zone. A compromise, as though they were torn between two instincts: do not honor her, but do not abandon her completely. That tension is visible in the bones. Her limbs were partially aligned, suggesting a body once intact, but her skull was turned, her jaw dislocated, the iron nail forced into place not long after the flesh had softened, but not yet gone. This wasn't a punishment inflicted years later. It was done quickly, almost immediately. The haste speaks volumes. Perhaps she died suddenly. Perhaps she died during a time of illness or unrest, when answers were scarce and fear was high, and when the body was found. Or perhaps even watched as it felt. They didn't send for clergy. They sent for a nail. In this act, we see a people caught between two worlds. The world of Christianity ritual, salvation, sacred order, and the world beneath Etolder, murkier, filled with unnamed forces and remembered dangers. Iron, in early Irish lore, had power. It was believed to bind, to seal, to interrupt magic. Iron hung above doorways to repel spirits. Iron horseshoes were nailed to walls, and in this case, it was used not to hold a door shut, but to seal a life. And yet, it didn't work, because her bones were found, uncovered, named, studied, and now her story is told in articles, museums, and films. Not as a cautionary tale, but as a question. What are we so afraid women might say? That we keep trying to bury their voices. The archaeologists who studied her noted something else. There were no signs of trauma on the rest of her skeleton. No evidence of physical violence. No broken ribs. No marks of execution or beating. Just the mouth. That detail matters. She wasn't silenced by force during life. She was silenced in death, meaning her words had lived on after her, and that's what had to be stopped. Even centuries later, we still speak in her terms. The witch of Kiltasheen. Okay. But in reality, she may have never called herself that. She may have been a midwife, a widow, a mother, or a healer. Her story was shaped by those who buried her, not by her own choices. In that shaping, it never really stopped. History does this. It writes over bones. It names the nameless. It invents cause from effect. And sometimes it's only when we listen to the body itself, when we kneel beside the grave and let the iron speak, that we begin to hear something older. The truth isn't loud. It's quiet, complicated. It's covered in soil and moss and forgotten grief. But it rises, bone by bone. And so her story lives not in records, but in silence that was broken, in the questions that remain. Why her? Why that burial? Why that mouth? And perhaps most of all, what did her words mean? That they were feared long after she was gone. Because it wasn't just a voice they tried to bury. It was a presence, a memory, a woman who mattered enough to be silenced, but not enough to be remembered until now. And maybe, just maybe, the iron was never meant to hold her down. Maybe it was meant to hold ourselves together, to make sure no one else had to be feared simply for being heard. And yet, centuries passed and the rust held until one day, someone with a trowel and a notebook found her jaw twisted but intact and began to write. And with that writing, her silence ended. She speaks now not in spells, not in warnings, but in remembrance, which leads to the final question, the one that cannot be answered by history or bone. If she were alive today, would we still try to keep her quiet? Or would we, at last, listen? In the cold green silence of Rathcreon, the land doesn't speak, it hums, low and long, like the memory of something buried deeper than time. The hills here are rounded like shoulders. The earth feels soft underfoot, but it hides stone and bone. For centuries, people have walked across these fields, unaware that they were walking on the skin of the dead. Beneath the grass lie hundreds of burial sites. Some are formal, circular mounds crowned with stone. Others are little more than indentations in the soil, marked only by shifts in the wind and scattered fragments of history. And beneath several of these graves, archaeologists found something odd. Food, not grave goods, not symbolic offerings, but real, perishable food piled near the bodies, often long after burial. Barley, oat cakes, dried meats, and even dairy residue. Burnt offerings, charred animal bones, bits of ash and charcoal from ritual fires. And sometimes the food wasn't buried at all. It was left just above ground, as though someone expected the dead to rise. Not as spirits or shadows, but as hungry mouths in need of feeding. Why? To understand this, we must begin with the truth that most cultures once believed. The dead could feel, not in the way the living do, but in a way that mattered. They could be comforted or disturbed. They could be welcomed or offended. And in early Ireland, it was not enough to bury someone with dignity. That dignity had to be maintained, replenished, remembered. Some communities believed that neglecting the dead could lead to misfortune. Cattle would grow sick, fields would fail, children would be born too early or not at all. And the cure? It wasn't prayer, it was hospitality. Feeding the dead, in early Irish belief, was an act of ritual continuity, a form of remembering that was practical, not just spiritual. You fed them so they would not come seeking food elsewhere. This belief, though strange to modern ears, was deeply logical within its world. Life was uncertain. Food was never guaranteed. And hunger was not just physical light, was social. To be remembered meant to be full. To be forgotten meant to be cold, distant, starving. And so, the graves at Rathcrogan were not closed spaces. They were doors. Some were reopened, not to exhume, to offer. The act wasn't dramatic. There were no chants, no performances, just quiet, repetitive gestures, placing oatcakes at a stone, leaving meat beside a mound, scattering grain near a ring fort that was once home to the dead. This wasn't necromancy. It was care, and it tells us something remarkable. The people of early Ireland didn't just fear the dead. They loved them, even when they were dangerous, even when they whispered at night, even when they dreamed themselves into the minds of the living. They were fed because they were part of the family, and in this way, death wasn't an absence. It was a hunger, and hunger could be sated. But there's another layer here, one that complicates the story, because not every grave was fed. Only some, specifically the ones believed to house the restless dead. There are stories from this region, quiet, half-forgotten myths of spirits that wandered because they had not been properly mourned. They weren't evil. They were incomplete, unfinished deaths, interrupted transitions. People who had died in battle, in childbirth, in exile. Their graves, when identifiable, became sites of ongoing care. Sometimes the offerings were symbolic. A bit of milk poured at dawn, a crumb from the evening loaf. Other times, the gestures were elaborate feasts held beside the graves on certain days of the year. And sometimes, bones were disturbed, not in anger, but in confusion. Some bodies were reburied, some were turned, some were placed in new mounds, and in each case, food followed, because to re-enter someone without feeding them was an act of violence, and the people of Rathcrogan knew that. They felt it in their bones, which brings us to a curious pattern in several burial sites across the region, especially those dating to the early Iron Age. Archaeologists have found signs of post-burial cooking. Fire pits just above graves, charred animal bones, cracked cooking stones. This wasn't cremation. This was picnicking, meals shared at the threshold between worlds. And what's more, the food was not always taken away. Some of it was left behind, intentionally laid out in patterns, pressed into small ceramic vessels, tucked between the stones with care. It's tempting to see this as symbolic, but what if it wasn't? What if the people of Rathcrogan believed truly, practically, that the dead still needed sustenance? Not metaphorically. Bodily, that hunger crossed the divide between life and death. Not because the dead were demons, but because they were kin. This idea lives on in later, Keir swamped up The suicide hosts of the dead were believed to ride at night, visiting their old homes, their old hearts, seeking warmth and food. Milk was left out. Bread was placed on windowsills. Doors were unlocked to invite the living, but to remember the dead. And in Rathcrogan, these stories may have roots far older than we thought, because these graves, they aren't just graves. They're places where memory was active, where death required maintenance. And if that maintenance was neglected, the dead reminded you. There's a story, half myth, half memory, of a farmer who plowed too close to an old mound. His cattle sickened. His child fell ill. He asked the village priest what to do. The answer was an exorcism. It was OATCAKE, laid in a ring at dawn for 7 days, and whether it worked or not didn't matter. The point was this: the dead had been noticed, and that noticing was nourishment. Which brings us back to the hungry graves of Rathcrogan. Why were some buried with food? Why were others fed decades later? Why do the ashes of cooked meals still lie above bones that haven't been disturbed in 2,000 years? Because these were not burials of fear. They were burials of relationship. And in early Ireland, relationships didn't end at death. They continued, like hunger, like memory, like stories told quietly to yourself at night when the house is still and the wind brushes the thatch in just the wrong way. Which leaves us with the question the archaeologists couldn't answer. Were the people of Rathcrogan feeding the dead? Feeding their own fear of forgetting them? Or maybe those are the same thing. Maybe we feed the dead because part of us still needs them full, still needs them near, still needs to believe they haven't. It's truly left. Not entirely. Not while the oatcakes are warm. Not while the milk hasn't soured. Not while someone, anyone, remembers to leave a bite behind. The wind moves differently through Rathcrogan after Samhain, the festival of endings, the thinning of the veil, the day when the living stepped softly. This ancient turning point was not just about the coming winter. It was about hunger. For food, yes, but also for memory. And among the burial mounds of Connaught, it was said that forgetting a grave could bring ruin. Not right away. Not with thunder or fire. Slowly. Bread that never rose again. Milk that spoiled too soon. A cow that wandered off and never returned. The forgotten dead made themselves known. And the people who lived on this land for generations never laughed at the idea. They whispered it like a bruise. Everyone knew, but no one pressed. Because to forget a grave was to deny a relationship. An Irish burial was never just disposal, it was negotiation. You placed the body into the earth, but part of you stayed with it. You owed the dead. And sometimes they collected. This was the heart of the rituals observed across Rathcrogan and its sister sites. Not exorcisms, not purifications, but offerings. Not to gods, not to demons, to the buried. Some rituals were small, personal, a bit of porridge at the doorstep on the anniversary of a death, sliver of meat pressed into the roots of a hawthorn that grew atop a forgotten grave. Other offerings were larger, public feasts beside barrows, bonfires lit, not in celebration, but in cautious gratitude, shared meals where an extra portion was served, and then left untouched. And always, it's the same quiet rule. The dead must not hunger, because a hungry dead was a moving dead. Not bodily, not always, but in presence, in outcome. And in this land, outcome was everything. A failed lambing season wasn't. Just misfortunate was a question. Who have we neglected? A failed courtship, a house that refused to warm, a dream that returned night after night. Whispering a name you hadn't said in years, all were seen as signs that someone had been left behind. Not unburied, but unfed. There are archaeological hints that this belief shaped the very landscape. Some ringforts once thought to be purely defensive contain unusual fire pits near their perimeters, not central hearths, but external ovens. Ash and food residue suggest repeated cooking, but no consumption, the best explanation. Offerings, meals prepared for others, for those who did not walk among the living, but waited just beneath. Even in Christian times, these habits persisted, though they changed names. All Souls Day replaced Samhain, but the oatcakes remained. The prayers were shorter, but the doors were still left unlocked, and in certain places, like Rathcrogan, the boundaries stayed sought. Farmers from the 17th century wrote about avoiding certain fields during twilight. Children were warned not to play near certain stones, not because of wolves or snakes, but because of voices. They weren't frightening voices, just familiar ones. A grandmother's laugh, a father's sigh, a child's breath, too young to have ever spoken, and always the same whispered question. Did you forget? Sometimes forgetting was unintentional. A family moved away. Grave was covered by moss. Story was left untold. But the dead remembered. They always remembered. That's why graves were marked with food, not just stones. Because food is presence. It rots, it sours, it vanishes, but in doing so, it shows that someone came. And in Rathcrogan, the act of feeding the dead became part of the land's rhythm. It wasn't superstition. It was etiquette, a social practice that bound generations together. That said, we do not forget you, even when we no longer speak your name, which makes the archaeological evidence all the more haunting. In some mounds, layers of offerings stretch across centuries. One particular grave, dated to around 200 BCE, contains not just the body of a woman, but multiple burned layers above it. Each layer contains remnants of cooking, lamb bones, bread, ash, cracked cooking stones, each separated by decades. Someone kept returning, long after the burial, long after the memory should have faded. Someone fed her again and again. Why? We don't know who she was. There is no inscription, no carving. It's bones and ash and food. But perhaps she didn't need a name. Perhaps her hunger was enough to draw memory to her side, because hunger has a gravity, and in Rathcrogan, that gravity lingered. It pulled people back to places they should have forgotten. It made them pause near mounds without knowing why. It reminded them that the dead were not gone, only waiting, which leads us to a quieter fear. Not that the dead would rise, but that they would go elsewhere, that they would move on. UNFED, unloved. UNREMEMBERED. Because in Irish belief, there are fates worse than haunting. There is absence. There is the hollowing. The idea that a grave, once forgotten, becomes something. Like a hole in the world, a place where meaning unravels, where weather turns strange, where the land refuses to settle. There are farmers today who still won't build over certain rises. Not because they believe in ghosts, but because the ground feels wrong, soft where it should be firm, cold even in July. They don't speak of curses. They speak of respect. They say, that place isn't mine, and they leave a piece of bread behind, just in case. This quiet tradition, the feeding, the remembering, was never about fear, not really. It was about relationship, about the deep Irish understanding that the past is not behind us, it is underneath us. It breathes through the soil. It waits in the mounds. It asks not to be worshipped, but to be acknowledged. And the best acknowledgement, a meal, a gesture, a moment of presence. You kneel, you place the bread, you say nothing, and in that silence, someone is full again. Which brings us to the last story passed down in Rathcrogan. It's not a myth, it's not a history, a pattern. It is said that for every grave fed in silence, A child in the village sleeps through the night. Not magic, not miracle, just balance. The dead are full, and so the living rest. But the reverse, a grave left hungry, a story left untold. That is when the dreams come, and the wind sounds like someone chewing in the dark. The dark. In Rathgragan, the hills do not rise for beauty. They rise because something beneath them was meant to be held, not imprisoned, just contained. The landscape rolls like the sea after a storm, calm on the surface, but holding memory in its depth. And among those rolling green folds lies a pattern older than writing, not a monument, not a temple, but a practice, a bargain made between the living and the dead, renewed again and again with barley and bread, with ash and bone, with silence, because here, in the quiet center of ancient Ireland, the dead were not sealed away, they were fed. And as the centuries wore on and beliefs shifted, the bargain never truly broke. It just changed names. What the early people called hunger, the monks would later call unrest. What they once answered with oatcakes, they answered now with prayer. But the rhythm remained. Rathcrogan was one of the ancient royal sites of Ireland, a ceremonial center linked with the legendary Queen Meb, with the epic Tain Bor Kalenj, and with gods older than the language that now tells their stories. But long before it was a seat of kings, it was a seat of the burial. Mounds stretch across the plain. Many predate written history. They are not arranged with symmetry. They are not lined like soldiers. They curve like breath, and archaeologists, digging carefully between the grasses, have noticed something strange. Graves that should have been forgotten weren't. Long after burial, people returned, not for relics, not to mourn, but to bring food. Not every grave was treated this way, only some, and in those mounds, patterns began to emerge. Remains of cooked lamb, roasted barley, cracked bones from pigs, charred hazelnuts, vessels for curdled milk. All items that would spoil quickly, all found atop or just beside the grave, in layers that suggested they were not part of the original burial. These were repeat visits, decades sometimes, terrace after death. Why? Modern minds might say ritual, simple, cultural expression, but to the people who lived then, it may have been much simpler. They were keeping a promise, because in early Irish belief, the world was not divided into two realms, living and dead, but held together by an overlap. The dead didn't leave. They just stepped sideways, and if you were lucky, they stayed quiet. But if you were careless, they reminded you. The dead didn't haunt in horror, they haunted in hunger. They became the cold patch by the hearth, huff, the shadow that wouldn't go. The strange dream of a face, half remembered but vividly cleared out. And so, families returned, not to grieve, but to nourish. A bit of food, a whispered name, a gesture that said, I remember, I still feed you. I know you are near. And, perhaps most surprisingly, this practice lasted far longer than you might think. In 2007, a team excavating one of Rathcrogan's satellite mounds uncovered a pit beside a grave that had been undisturbed since the early Iron Age. In that pit were the remains of a fire, several burnt animal bones, and a bit of partially carbonized grain-likely barley. The grave had not been disturbed, but the earth beside it had been dug, burned, and used, not once, several times. The carbon dating showed deposits from multiple centuries, which means someone many someone's kept. Returning not to dig, just to feed. What makes this remarkable is not the presence of food, but the intentional repetition. This was not a funeral rite. It was a relationship, maintained across generations. Perhaps the buried one had been important. Perhaps they had died in fear. Perhaps they had spoken words that echoed too long. Whatever the reason be, They were not forgotten, not by blood, not by ritual, not by the earth. And this tells us something quietly. It's profound. In early Ireland, being remembered was a kind of afterlife. Not heaven, not paradise, just presence. And to be present meant to be fed. This logic extended even to those whose names were lost in several places across Connaught, including Rathcroke. Farmers have long told stories of lonely mound seals with no known grave, no remembered name, but which still received offerings, even in the 19th century. Travelers recorded tales of families who, when passing certain hills, would leave bits of bread, pour drops of milk, or mutter prayers for the forgotten one. They didn't know who was buried there, but they knew someone was, and that was enough. Because hunger doesn't need a name, only a mouth. Which raises a question. What did the people of Rathcrogan think happened when the dead were not fed? What was the consequence? Not horror, not violence, but imbalance. A sense that something was off. Sam Hain brought this fear to the surface. The veil was thin, the air felt different, and the need to acknowledge the dead became urgent. That's why so many offerings appear near graves during that time of year. Fires rekindled, food left out, names spoken aloud, not in summoning, but in gratitude, to keep the bargain intact, to remind the dead that they were still seen, still remembered, still fed. Even today, echoes of this survive in rural Irish homes. It's not uncommon to leave a piece of bread on the windowsill on All Souls' Eve. Most people don't remember why. It's just something we do. But that gesture has roots in Rathcrogan, in the long silence between burial and forgetting, and in the belief that memory, like bread, must be shared, which leads us to the quietest truth of all. These rituals, the food, the fire, the gesture were never really for the dead. They were for the living, to ease the guilt of forgetting, to create a rhythm for grief, to soften the sharp edge of absence. And so, even now, the hills of Rathcrogan hold not just bodies, but promises, oaths made in silence, renewed in food, and fulfilled in the quiet knowledge that someone came back again, and again, and again, to kneel, to light a fire, to break the bread, and to whisper, "You are not alone, alone." In the heart of Connaught lies a hill shaped like an old back, slumped and heavy, rising gently from the plain. To most, it is just another curve in the green, but to those who have walked the older paths, who have stood still long enough to hear what the earth remembers, it is more than a hill. It is a mouth, and what it breathes is older than memory. Locals call it Oinagata, Cave of the Cats, but long before the name took that shape, the stories whispered another meaning. The Gate of the Dead, because this small, easily missed opening in the hillside was believed to be a door, not a metaphorical one, a literal passage into the realm beneath, a place where things waited, and at Samhain they came out. Owenagat is not large. You have to stoop to enter. It doesn't descend like a well. It slopes like a sigh, leading into narrow darkness, into stone made damp with centuries. But those who ventured in did not describe a simple tunnel. They spoke of a presence, of air that felt too still, of echoes that returned, slightly wrong, inside. The cave splits, bends, and stops. It doesn't lead far, but for over 2,000 years, people treated it as a center, a portal, a site of emergence, and the rituals that surrounded it quiet, boring, repetitive are recorded not in scripture but in landscape, because at Samhain, this cave wasn't empty, it was active. Ancient Irish myth tells of creatures emerging from Owenagat. During the festival that marked the beginning of winter, they weren't demons. They were beings, unnatural in their motion, unfinished in their form. Some stories say they were spectral warriors, Others say they were animals made monstrous cats with human tongues, cows that breathed flame, birds whose wings cut like blades. But others speak of something quieter, shadows, not creatures, not visions, just forms that stepped out of the cave and into the fields, passing through the air like memory and fog. And what were they looking for? Not war, not conquest, but recognition. Because Oanagat was not a prison, it was a threshold, and thresholds must be maintained. For centuries, people came to the hill as Samhain, not to summon, but to acknowledge, to mark the doorway, to light fires near it, not to ward off evil, but to warm the passage, so that those returning might find their way gently, because it was understood that some among the dead would rise, not to frighten the living, but to be near them, just for a night, just for a few hours, to sit by the fires again, to smell bread baking, to remember what it meant to be warm. That's why food was left outside, not as tribute, but as hospitality. The same bread you gave your neighbor, the same milk you gave your child, offered not in fear, but in welcome, because the dead who walked on Swen were not strangers, they were yours, and they came from the cave in the hill. Oanagat is littered with evidence of long-vanished ritual, shards of burnt bone, soot in places where no light reaches, iron scraps worn smooth, even graffiti agam script carved into the rock walls, recording names and warnings. One such carving reads, Richi Maki Medvifrak, son of Meb, name from the old tales. A man swallowed by the other world, returned in myth, but remembered here in rock. In silence, in a space where the living still stooped to read the names of the dead. And this tells us something subtle. The cave was not feared. It was used, not as a passage to flee from, but as a site to interact with, to bargain, to listen. Some stories say that kings journeyed into Oanagat for prophecy. They sat in the dark. They waited for whispers. They listened to the dead speak not in words, but in feelings. And when they emerged, they ruled with caution, because to sit in that cave was to sit in the memory of everything Ireland had lost, every famine, every betrayal, every name forgotten too soon. And at Samhain, the veil between memory and presence faded, and the dead came to ask, do you still remember me? So the living answered, with bread, with fire, with silence, because in silence the dead could hear again, not the noise of mourning, but the absence of forgetting. And yet the cave is still, no grand structure surround it, no temple, no altar dot, just a quiet opening, often missed, often passed by, but to those who know is still a place of pause. Even now, some passers-by leave something at the mouth, a coin, a bit of cloth, a flower from the hedge, not because they believe in monsters, but because they remember a time when people remembered, in memory. Like bread, must be offered, even if no one takes it, especially then at Samhain. The stories tell us the mounds across Ireland hum, not with ghosts, but with attention. The dead are listening, not for cries, but for continuity, for signs that the line has not broken, that the names haven't all been erased, that the cave is still known, still respected, still considered a door, even if no one walks through. Which brings us back to the shape of the cave itself. It narrows, then opens slightly. The walls are uneven. The floor dips. There's nothing dramatic about it, and yet it persists. People who enter often describe the same thing. They come out changed, not haunted, just quieted, as if something inside Stim has sat down, taken its place, and gone still. That's the true power of Oanagat, not what comes out, but what it reminds us to carry, that the past is not gone, that the dead are not distant, that memory must be fed, and that some doors never really close, even when covered in grass, even when no one speaks their name, even when we forget why we built them. They wait, not for screams, but for bread. And in the cave, the air remains unchanged, still, expectant, breathing, breathing. In the old stories, the cave had no guard, no iron gate, no stone seal, no boundary carved to warn intruders. Just an opening low, damp, and uneven where the grass gave way to shadow. This is what made Owenagat unusual. Most mythic doors to the underworld are grand, but here the threshold is small. You have to bend, and that's the point. Entering the cave is not a show of power, it's a gesture of humility. And in ancient Ireland, humility before the dead was a kind of wisdom, because the dead didn't stay put. They expected things. They weren't malevolent, but they were patient. And over time, their expectations became law, not written in ink, of it, remembered in bone, in habit, in the soft choreography of rituals repeated every year when the sky turned gray and the winds changed direction. At Samhain, the old year ended. It was not just the start of winter, it was the reset of time. The door between the worlds thinned, and the people responded not with chaos, but with preparation. They swept, they baked, they kept a place at the table. They walked past Owenagat, with heads bowed not in fear, but in recognition, because the dead were listening, and they remembered how you remembered them. That was the unspoken contract. You forget them, and the world forgets you in return. The crops fail. The milk won't churn. A child gets sick for no reason. To modern ears, these are just superstitions, weather and misfortune. But to the people who shaped Ireland's earliest mythologies, these events were consequences of a relationship neglected. You didn't just survive winter by preparing food and mending roofs. You survived by honoring your ancestors, not abstractly, but practically, with food, with story, with presence. This was why people returned to the mounds, why they left bits of bread at the cave, why the fire was kept going all night on Samhain, for warmth, but for guidance. The flame was a light for the returning. You didn't want the dead to get lost, because the returning dead weren't always solid. Sometimes they were shadows, sometimes just reminders. A thought that wouldn't leave you alone, a song in your head you hadn't heard since childhood, a dream that ends with the name of someone long buried. These weren't seen as hauntings, they were nudges, and the proper response was simple. Feed them, not with grand offerings, but with the quiet gestures that say, I have not forgotten. This is why Samhain meals were elaborate, not just for guests, but for visitors. You didn't know who might come. You left the door unlatched, the fire high, an extra place set, and if the food disappeared, that was good. It meant someone had returned. Even today, some rural parts of Ireland, families leave out bits of food on Samhain night. They no longer say it's for the dead. They say it's just tradition. But traditions come from somewhere, and here they come from Owenagat, not just the cave itself, but what it represented. It wasn't just a hole in the earth, it was a memory you could visit, a place where the line between worlds didn't break, ain't simply blurred. This belief wasn't isolated across Europe. There are legends of thin places, locations where the boundary between realms was porous, but few were so specific, so consistently tied to yearly ritual. As Owenagat, it's mentioned in medieval texts like the Den Chanjas and La Baragabala, errant books of place lore and origin. They describe the cave as a source of monsters, spirits, and omens, but they also describe it as a place where people went to learn. Druids, kings, storytellers, they sat in the dark and listened, not for prophecy, but for instruction, because the dead weren't just memory, they were advice. Every family had its own rituals. Some baked special cakes, Others lit 3 fires. Few recited long lists of names, great-grandparents, cousins, even forgotten infants, all spoken aloud, just once, so they could be heard again. Not because the dead would reward you, but because you would remember yourself. You are not a floating point in time. You are a link in a chain. And at Samhain, that chain tightened. It clinked softly through every house, and no one dared ignore it. That's why even the poorest families prepared something extra. A crust of bread, a corner of butter, a drop of cider in a cracked mug. Left out, no questions, no explanations. And if the bread was gone in the morning, well, someone had been fed. Maybe a grandmother, maybe a child, maybe someone whose name had been forgotten, but whose need remained, because the dead were not sustained by hunger alone. They were sustained by attention. The cave doesn't speak, it doesn't moan, but those who spend time near it notice little things. Birds won't nest at the mouth. Grass grows strange around its edge, less, then patchy, then lush again, like something beneath the soil is breathing too slowly to see. And dogs, even the brave ones, hesitate there. They sniff, they back away, not in fear, in respect, because the animals remember. But we forget that some places are active, not cursed, not blessed, just occupied. The land isn't empty, it listens, and every year, when the season turns, it expects a response. Not fireworks, not prayers, just bread, a gesture, a name spoken aloud, a light left burning. And if those things are given, the winter is easier, not warmer, not kinder, just tolerable, because the relationship has been maintained. You fed what feeds you, and the world, for a moment, aligns. By the time the first Christian monks arrived at the green ridges of Connaught, Owenagat had already lived through hundreds of winters. It had swallowed the dead. It had witnessed firelit offerings, dawning. It had waded through storm in silence, and yet it remained untouched by temples or conquest. The monks didn't bring war. They brought parchment. They listened to stories spoken around hearths. They recorded them, shaped them, softened them, but they didn't erase the cave, because even they sensed it held something that couldn't be rewritten. Instead, translated it. In early Christian Ireland, many older pagan sites were adapted, not destroyed. Holy wells became baptismal fonts. Trees of offering became saints' groves. And Owenagat, the mouth through which the dead returned at Samhain, became cautionary footnote in texts like the Book of Leinster and Dinshaunches. The cave is still mentioned, but now the language shifts. Instead of a threshold to the other world, it is described as the birthplace of monsters. Instead of welcoming ancestors, it births chaos. It becomes the source of darkness. Rather than its balance, the old beings who emerged from it once Onodar, now corrupted. Take, for instance, the story of Elon the Burner, a spectral figure said to rise from the cave each Samhain to set fire to Terra with music and flame. In older tellings, Elon was a kind of threshold spirit, evil nor good, simply marking the passage from one year to the next, a being of transition. But in Christian versions, Caelan becomes a dangerous problem solved by St. Fune Mac Cumhale, who slays him, ending the old era. In this retelling, the cave is not a place of return, it's a place of corruption. And yet, the people didn't stop visiting. They still came in October. They still lit fires. They still left bread, because even as the theology changed, the rhythm did not. There was still something about the turn of the year, the thinning of the veil, the cool breath of air that came from the cave, even when the rest of the land was still. Something you could feel in your bones. The monks may have called it superstition, but they never sealed the entrance, because even they knew there are some doors you don't close. You simply walk past them quietly, okay? And now the presence of Owenagat lingered beneath the newer teachings. Even in All Souls Day, okay, we find echoes of the old ways. on November 2nd. The church instructed the faithful to remember the dead, to pray for them, to feed the poor in their honor. And what is this, really, but a sanctioned version of Samhain? A new robe over an older body. Instead of food left for ancestral spirits, it became bread given to beggars in the name of the dead. But the instinct was the same. Don't forget them. They remember you. Even the traditions of soul cake small, pastries baked and given away stem directly from Samhain customs. A person would go door to door asking for food in exchange for prayers for the souls of the dead. And when the wind picked up and the nights grew long, the cave at Rathgrigan would wait, not for monsters, not for pilgrims, just for recognition. Even today, it's easy to pass by Oenagat without noticing it. There's no grand sign, just a slight dip in the land, a stone lintel, a narrow crack leading into shadow. But those who know what to look for often stop and listen. You don't hear anything. It's dramatic, just the sound of time moving backward, because the cave doesn't echo sound, it echoes memory, standing at its mouth. One begins to sense not just the cold of stone, but the weight of repetition. How many hands have touched this edge? How many feet stepped cautiously in? How many whispers, forgotten by history, still linger on the damp walls? The cave is not haunted. It is occupied by thousands of thoughts, fears, oaths, and hopes. And those who return to it, even now, tend to walk away quieter than they arrive. In the modern age, we talk of death clinically. We compartmentalize it. Hospitals, cemeteries, certificates. But to the people of ancient Ireland, death was not a break. It was a shift, a tilt in the light, a ripple in the fabric of the year. And Oenagat was the place where that ripple gathered. Every October, the stories say, the dead came through it not as vengeful ghosts, but as participants in the turning of the year, in the balance of memory, in the promise that nothing truly leaves if it is fed. Bread, names, warmth. These were the offerings, and they worked because the winters came and passed, and the people remained. This is the real story of Oenagat. Not the monsters, not the flames, but the gentle persistence of a tradition too old to trace, too quiet to notice, but too necessary to forget. The cave is still there. The grass still bends around it. The light still dims inside, faster than seems natural. And once a year, whether we realize it or not, we act as though we remember. We leave a candle, we bake extra, we speak a name aloud when no one is listening, because somewhere inside us, we still walk past that cave. We still feel the breath that comes from it, and we still hope that when our time comes, someone will leave a little bread for us too, just in case we ever need to come back.